is repugnant in a free and open society. And we are, as a people, inherently and historically opposed to secret societies, to secret oaths, and to secret proceedings. We decided long ago that the dangers of excessive and unwarranted concealment of pertinent facts far outweighed the dangers which are cited to justify it.
As yet another Western military-backed false flag event, this one in Syria, pushes us toward World War III, here's a timeless quote from Samuel Clemens, otherwise known as Mark Twain. "The statesman will invent cheap lies, putting the blame upon the nation that is attacked, and every man will be glad of those conscience-soothing falsities, and will diligently study them, and refuse to examine any refutations of them, and thus he will, by and by, convince himself the war is just, and will thank God for the better sleep he enjoys after this process of grotesque self-deception ensues." Again, from Mark Twain. As I've stated in so many broadcasts and presentations, as the biosphere implodes, the power structure will become rapidly more desperate. The law of the jungle will ensue. And we are descending into that time now. Much more on this subject later in this show and about this 1-hour news program. If you want biased, factless, just tell me something to make me feel good news, this is the wrong program for you. Only by fully facing painful truths head-on do we have any chance whatsoever of correcting our current course of certain near-term self-destruction. This is Dane Wigington with GeoEngineeringWatch.org Radio, the weekly edition of the Global Alert News Hour for April 8th, 2017. This commercial-free news hour is brought to you by GeoEngineeringWatch.org, paid for by GeoEngineeringWatch.org. No commercials, too much critical news to cover, not enough time to cover it. This show is broadcast throughout Northern California on 1670 AM, 104.9 FM, and 105.7 FM. Global Alert News is also rebroadcast on the East Coast by the PRN Radio Network on Saturdays at 2 p.m. Many other locations are also rebroadcasting this program now. My thanks to them for helping us to sound the alarm. As I state every week, for those in the Redding area, Shasta County, near enough to Orchard Nutrition to stop by and get some free materials on what's happening in your world, starting with the lethal vaccinations being given to our children and ourselves, on what really happened on 9/11, statement, testimony, and information from 3,000 of the world's top architects and engineers. Wouldn't you care about what they have to say about the biggest false flag to ever take place in our country? Certainly, without any dispute on that, the license by which the current aggression in the Middle East was unleashed by Western military powers. And you can get information on climate engineering, what's going on above your heads, lethal experiments carried out by your government that's contaminating your air column, your world, every breath you take, without your knowledge or your consent. If you care about any of these issues, and certainly you should, get free information at Orchard Nutrition. We simply ask that you please share that information with others. Make copies, circulate it, help us to sound the alarm. At 2:30 today, the latest edition of the free film screenings at the Redding Library will happen at 2:30 p.m. Vaccination Nation by Gary Knoll. Gary Knoll has done a tremendous amount to fight for the greater good. This is an essential film for all those who care about what they're injecting into their children, themselves, factual data that the medical industrial complex and the corporate media does not want you to know. Free materials will be there. I'll be there for Q&A after the film. This is a critical film on a critical issue. A population that's not healthy or thinking clearly can't deal with the kinds of issues that we must deal with if we're going to survive on this planet much longer. Again, 2:30 today, April 8th at the Redding Library. Also, Earth Day, April 22nd. GeoEngineeringWatch.org will have a booth at the Earth Day event in Redding. We'll be there all day with free materials, trying to deal with the single greatest assault on the environment ever launched by the human race. Not the only one by any means. We've been, as I've stated so many times, extremely poor stewards of our planet, but the single greatest assault ever unleashed mathematically is climate engineering. And how many people in the environmental community and the global warming community are even willing to talk about this giant elephant in the room of climate engineering? Isn't that a form of extreme hypocrisy? How can you care about the environment and not care about an event as cataclysmic as climate engineering? Question we should ask ourselves. We'll be at Earth Day again, April 22nd. Legal update. The Rhode Island draft legislation. It was resubmitted over a week ago by Rhode Island Representative Justin Price. It went before committee on Thursday in Rhode Island. The GeoEngineeringWatch.org legal team top attorney was there. We sent him there for this purpose, to meet with Representative Justin Price and to present before that committee from a legal perspective. I'll post additional details soon. Let's hope for the best from that outcome. We don't have all the details yet, but I'll post an audio of that presentation as well in the coming days. But that legislation is still, for the moment, active. Pressing on with one more announcement. The Autism One 2017 conference will be held this year in Colorado Springs, Colorado, from May 24th through May 28th, with over 100 speakers. This year, presenters include Dr. Suzanne Humphreys, Robert F. Kennedy Jr., award-winning author Edwin Black, Drs. Heather and Jack Wolfson, Dr. Andrew Wakefield, and many additional healthcare professionals. If you want to find out from the frontline experts on this issue exactly how lethal the vaccinations are, exactly what's being hidden from organizations like the CDC, organizations that are supposedly there to protect us, attend this conference or find out about it, support it however you can. That's autism1.org. And before I get to an in-depth expose of the latest aggression by Western military powers in the Trump administration and their false flag event in Syria, I want to point out that what does our society and the so-called agencies that are supposedly addressing the epidemic autism, the epidemic dementia, the epidemic Alzheimer's, what do these agencies tell us to do? Do they ever in any way, shape, or form focus on some of the root causes of these issues, starting with the constant toxic heavy metal aerosol spraying occurring above our heads every single day, and the lethal heavy metal filled vaccinations that are being forced upon us now? Do any of these organizations ever address these core issues that are causing these epidemics of autism, dementia, and Alzheimer's? No. What do they tell us to do? They want to promote awareness weeks. April is Autism Awareness Month, for an example. And here's a report from the agencies pushing this Autism Awareness Month. It says, nearly a quarter century ago, the Autism Society launched a nationwide effort to promote autism awareness, inclusion, and self-determination for all, and assure that each person with autism is provided the opportunity to achieve the highest possible quality of life. This year, we want to go beyond simply promoting autism awareness and encouraging friends and collaborators to become partners in the movement toward acceptance and appreciation. I don't want to accept autism. I don't want to accept that this is normal for a 40,000% increase in autism since 1975. What rational person would accept that that's normal? And if you're one of those people that's accepting that because you want to be a part of the herd, you don't want to speak out, you don't want to say anything against the medical industrial complex or be singled out with your friends that are also convinced that vaccinations are some sort of wonderful health benefit when we have autism escalating statistically 40,000%. If you're in that category, change directions. Start by coming today. If you're in the Reading area, come to the screening today at the Reading Library. Find out what you don't know, what you didn't want to know, but what you can't fix or make better unless you do know. You can't face dire issues unless you face the truth surrounding those issues. And this is what we have, again, from the Autism Society, from a Dementia Awareness Week, which is May 14th through the 20th. Same thing. Let's just accept it and pretend it's all normal. It's not normal. It's not normal for dementia to be the number one cause of mortality, already stated in Europe and coming in the U.S. as well. It's now 1 out of 3 seniors die with die with dementia and or Alzheimer's. Does anyone think that's normal? That's not rational to think that's normal. And these organizations simply want to convince us it's all normal. We should just embrace it. We should just accept it and donate our funds to them for trying to help us accept it. The Alzheimer's Foundation, as I've stated in previous shows, when they came to Reading and I tried to offer a $500 donation for geoengineeringwatch.org to have a booth there to simply share data that there's aluminum in our environment and aluminum is connected with Alzheimer's. They flatly refused to allow me to support that event, refused me a booth, said they didn't want anything about the aluminum issue to come up at all, even though there's peer-reviewed study to prove aluminum is directly connected to Alzheimer's. We have members of the aluminum industry sitting on the Alzheimer's Foundation board. How big a conflict of interest do we need? And when I showed up at that event with flyers, factual, informational flyers to point out that there's aluminum in our environment coming down in our air column, showing up in our water, connected to Alzheimer's, the first thing they did was threaten to arrest me. And as I've stated before, I invited them to do so. So much more attention that would have brought to our issue, and they backed off, and we passed out flyers there. My thanks to the activists who helped. That's the sort of hypocrisy we have with these foundations. Total hypocrisy. Same with a lot of the environmental foundations as well, as I've stated over and over. Total hypocrisy, not facing the most major issues, starting with climate engineering. Now, I want to get to what's happening globally because, as most who are even slightly awake know, we're being pushed toward World War III. And as I've stated over and over on broadcast after broadcast, the following fact, that biosphere implosion would further fuel power structure desperation, and the naked aggression of the U.S. military has so far been completely accepted and even embraced by an unfortunately high percentage of the U.S. population. I would ask this: when will sanity prevail? How many countries does the U.S. have to topple and or invade in the name of pursuing, quote, U.S. interests, which simply means in the interest of the central bankers, corporatocracy, and the military-industrial juggernaut of insanity? This is not to say that other global powers are innocent or benign. Not at all. All of them are corrupt. All of them are criminal. But as the proverb goes, how can we tell others to take the splinter from their eyes when we have a log in our own? What's the root cause of the latest horrible false flag attack in Syria and the potential World War III triggering aggression that the U.S. military has unleashed using the chemical weapons false flag as their excuse? What started all the conflict and carnage in the Middle East to begin with? And very few Americans have any clue whatsoever of the facts. Does any truly informed, rational person believe that Syria would carry out a chemical attack when they have already all but won the war against the U.S.-backed terrorists, ISIS? When they, Syria, long ago willingly gave up all their chemical weapons, when they, Syria, would of course know that such an attack as this chemical attack is exactly what the U.S. was looking for as an excuse to attack them. Syria was not behind this attack. The U.S.-backed terrorists were. And let's revisit the last such false flag attack in Syria as a comparison. This is from 2013. The Syrians had already willingly given up their chemical weapons, willingly invited the UN inspectors into their country, and the day the inspectors arrive, a chemical attack happens that's blamed on the Syrian government. Whatever one feels about the Syrian government, and I'm not saying that they're benign or innocent either, but what I'm saying is this: from any perspective, why would they carry out either of these attacks that are in every way completely destructive to their own interests and completely conducive to triggering unbridled U.S. aggression? And let's carry this point a bit further. If the U.S. and Western powers had no strategic interest in taking down Syria, along with all the other Middle Eastern countries that the U.S. has helped to topple since the 9/11 false flag, would our military or our media even have noticed a few hundred dead civilians if there were not strategic interests involved, U.S. interests? When will the American population notice that if U.S. interests, i.e. resources or some other form of expanding hegemonic power, if those interests aren't involved, nobody cares how many people die, do they? Our media doesn't care, our military doesn't care, and unfortunately most of our population doesn't care. How much does our media and our military talk about the 500,000 children that are believed to have been killed as a direct result of the U.S. sanctions against Iraq that had nothing to do with 9/11. Iraq had no WMD, and in fact, less than 2 weeks ago, a U.S. airstrike killed over 200 civilians in Mosul. Did the U.S. military or media care about that? What about the U.S. airstrike that killed almost 100 Syrian soldiers that were fighting ISIS terrorists at a key location? Why does the U.S. military again and again and again seem to accidentally kill those that are most committed to fighting ISIS? What about the ongoing U.S.-supported slaughter of innocent civilians in Yemen? Over 10,000 dead and counting. The U.S. is not only supporting the despotic Saudi regime's assault against these innocent Yemeni populations, the U.S. military is also carrying out its own airstrikes in Yemen, killing even more civilians. And how about another example that involves the slaughter of over 800,000 civilians? Did the U.S. media or U.S. military ever say or do anything about the nearly 1 million, over 800,000, as I just stated, 1 million innocents that were brutally murdered in Rwanda? Many literally hacked to death with machetes. Did our media or our military do a thing to stop this genocide? Nothing. And historically, almost no Americans have any idea how many genocide committing governments our government has backed. But unless there are U.S. interests at stake, meaning resources that the military-industrial complex and the central bankers need, the military or the media doesn't give a damn. That's the fact of the matter. Forgive me if I continue with this rant, but it needs to be said. Donald Trump is nothing more than a puppet dangling at the end of the power structure's strings. Nothing more than an actor in the play. A play that is an ongoing and completely orchestrated drama that the majority of the U.S. population seems prone to fall for over and over and over. Trump, Obama, the Bushes, the Clintons, it matters not. All are just props in this play. Trump's statements about wanting to defeat ISIS are completely transparent lies. The same as Obama's statements of wanting to defeat ISIS, absolute lies. The U.S. spawned, fueled, funded, armed ISIS from the beginning. I would challenge anyone that doesn't believe this to actually investigate the matter. Investigate the photos of psychotic warmonger John McCain standing with ISIS leaders. Investigate the fact that ISIS equipment, like guns and fleets of trucks, were supplied by the Pentagon. The blatant and false flag chemical attack in Syria is to justify yet more illegal and unjust aggression from the completely out of control U.S. military-industrial complex. The Syrian false flag chemical attacks, just the latest in a long and growing list of criminal acts of aggression, stretching back to Vietnam and beyond. The historically indisputable Gulf of Tonkin incident, completely staged by the U.S. military and U.S. leaders, and the subsequent years of war in which nearly 600,000 of our military men and women died needlessly, countless injured, and how many completely innocent civilians died? Millions. In fact, they're still dying from the Vietnam War thanks to all the landmines and toxic chemicals we dumped on their country. The blatant assault against Syria, justified by a blatant false flag event, is just the latest in the long line of Eurasian Middle Eastern countries that our country said it would take down immediately after the 9/11 false flag that was carried out on U.S. soil against U.S. civilians. This is exactly what General Wesley Clark was told and exactly what he stated on the record less than a week after 9/11. Clark said he was told about all the Middle Eastern countries that were going to be taken down, taken out, and the 9/11 false flag was the license to do so. And those who think 9/11 happened the way our government says it happened, you're living in an absolute delusion. It's time to wake up and face facts. Search 9/11 architects and engineers for truth and find out what you don't know. Find out what nearly 3,000 of the world's top experts have to say about the 9/11 false flag. It's a scientific impossibility for the official narrative to be true. The official narrative is a lie. So back to what Wesley Clark stated, all the countries that would be taken out, he was told a week after 9/11. This was obviously already planned for a very long time. Do any Americans even remember the fact that Saddam Hussein had exactly nothing to do with 9/11? Do any Americans remember that Saddam Hussein had no weapons of mass destruction, as I stated earlier? As we were told over and over and over again by the spineless criminal corporate media that must be considered accomplices in countless murderous crimes of the power structure. How many times on this very broadcast have I outlined the grand plan by the power structure to take out multiple Middle Eastern countries, the plan that's been laid out for decades by presidential advisor Zbigniew Brzezinski? Anyone listening to all that I'm saying who claims to care about their country, who claims to care about justice, who claims to care about a future for their children, who claims to care about the future of the entire planet and all life on it, anyone who claims to care about all those things has a responsibility to get up off the bench and actually investigate. And for those listening to this broadcast who might roll their eyes, cling tightly to their program bias and blind ideology, and walk away to shove their heads even further into the sand, I say this: if you believe turning your back and two blind eyes to the oncoming train will save you, you'll soon find out just how mistaken you are. All of us, everyone, are currently passengers on a ship that's going down by the day. If every single one of us does not summon our courage, if every single one of us does not summon our sense of justice, purpose, honor, and virtue, if every single one of us doesn't take every peaceful action in our power to correct the current course of insanity and omnicide, we're done. That's not an opinion. It's a mathematical fact. Forgive me if I continue in this rant. I'll get the headlines in a moment, but some things have to be said. What are we hearing from the corporate media about the Syrian strike and the U.S., quote, interests concerned? America first. What exactly does that mean? That we have the right to loot, pillage, plunder, raid, and otherwise occupy any country in the world that shows any resistance to our agenda of extracting and confiscating their resources so that we can maintain the, quote, American way of life, so that we can, in the words of Donald Trump, make America great again? Is that what makes a country great? Having a military that's bigger than the militaries of the next 10 countries combined? A military that's completely out of control and attempting to establish what they call, in their own words, full spectrum dominance over the entire world and even over their own citizens? Because that's exactly what we have. It's time to wake up. U.S. citizens are not only expendable to those in power, but are in fact a rapidly increasing liability to those in power. And here's a reminder. How many remember or even knew that their front doorstep was GPS located in the 2010 census? Why? Yes, we must ask ourselves why. I've been over this in previous broadcasts. It seems that even the Census Bureau itself did not know why they were doing this, as I communicated with them about this. And in my case, census representatives hiked almost a mile behind a locked gate to GPS my doorstep, not once, but twice, just to be sure. Why? Again, does all of this have anything to do with the drone bases being set up all over the country? And what better way to terrorize rapidly awakening populations? And this to control them, to keep them in line. If you don't think the train is that far off the tracks, you will soon. All of us will be forced to face that reality, a reality that's so glaring it can't be hidden much longer. And many would ask this, is there still time to change that course? And that depends on us, on what we do to sound the alarm, or what we don't do. We must start by holding the completely criminal corporate media and all that serve it publicly accountable. Peaceful protests should be organized and staged at every possible location that's pumping out the power structure, propaganda, and lies. Those in the media who are obediently serving the power structure at the expense of the population and the planet as a whole must be exposed. We must make sure that they know, we know who they are and what they're doing. They must know that once the ongoing crimes of those in power are fully exposed, from weather warfare to biological warfare to lethal vaccinations, fluoridated water, illegal surveillance, illegal warfare, and countless other crimes, that once these crimes are exposed, we, the population, will hold them accountable, the media, legally and morally accountable as accomplices in these crimes. All of us can locate the email contacts for the corporate media individuals that are disseminating the lies and propaganda of the power structure. We can carefully draft peaceful but powerful messages to them to point out that the public is rapidly waking up to the criminal lies they are helping to propagate, and that the public will likely, at some point soon, hold them legally and morally accountable. And when sending such a message, openly CC as many other rational citizens as you can from your region or further. This is up to all of us. It's up to all of us to put them on notice that we know who they are and they will be held legally and morally accountable. The shadow government and U.S. military they control is determined to achieve total hegemonic power over all countries and all populations, even at the cost of killing the entire planet in the process. And how can this happen? Because Americans and other populations of first world industrialized, militarized countries especially are letting it happen. Because too many of our military men and women don't want to know the truth. They don't want to face the truth. They don't want to even investigate the truth. They and major segments of the U.S. population are all too happy to live in the delusion that might is right, that other countries all over the world are happily handing over all their resources and food to us while they starve to death because they just want to help us. If you're an American that lives in such a delusion, if you're a military member that lives in such a delusion, you're part of the problem. If you're a member of the armed services and you believe the blatant propagandistic lies about the U.S. military only being used to spread freedom and democracy around the world, you also are a massive part of what's wrong in the world. And I support U.S. military members. I salute what they've done. I respect the price they have paid. And as I've stated in previous shows, I've given to DAV, Disabled American Veterans, for many years. VFW, Veterans of Foreign Wars. I worked to rehab brutally crippled Vietnam vets that were needlessly crippled. It broke my heart, absolutely broke my heart. That's what supporting our troops is, and I've done it. It's a lot more than sticking a magnetic emblem on your car that says support the troops and then backing everything the power structure does to kill, maim, decimate our brothers and sisters in the military. How is that supporting our troops? It's not. Time to end the hypocrisy, and for those in the military, please hear everything that I'm saying. The U.S. military and NATO are not about freedom and democracy. As I've stated again and again and again, the U.S. military and U.S. military interventions are about power and control. It's about full spectrum dominance, which also includes weather manipulation, climate engineering, weather warfare. The U.S. military is about crushing any country or leader who dares to try and carry out commerce without using the U.S. petrodollar, the global reserve currency, printed in limitless amounts by the central bankers that are ultimately the ones behind all the atrocities. And we let it happen. The U.S. military is about forcefully acquiring the fossil fuels it needs for its lifeblood, no matter what the cost to the planet or its people or the web of life. And for those that would accuse me of favoring other countries, again I would say this: such dichotomous thinking is only a poor excuse to fortify the denial of reality. I'm in no way condoning any other country. All are corrupt, none are benevolent, but as I stated earlier, and I will state again now, how can we condemn other countries when we, ourselves, our country, are engaged in a constant and ever-growing list of illegal and criminal acts of total aggression all over the planet? And how many countries occupied and or invaded in the last half century plus? Nearly 60. How many Americans stop to consider that? Some headlines, forgive that long rant, had to be said, but some headlines to back up everything I've just said. Headlines about the Syrian chemical attack false flag. Here's a headline from Global Research. Pentagon trained Syria's al-Qaeda rebels in the use of chemical weapons. Why is that a surprise? We've had 2 false flag chemical attacks in circumstances that clearly were not connected to the Syrian government, that would not have acted so contrary to its own interests. From that report, the Western media refutes their own lies. Not only do they confirm that the Pentagon has been training the terrorists in the use of chemical weapons, they also acknowledge the existence of a not-so-secret U.S.-backed plan to launch a chemical weapon attack on Syria and blame it on Assad's regime. This is very, very basic and transparent events that are happening. How can we not see right through them? And if you go on about your life and do nothing and say nothing and learn nothing and don't try to take a stand against this, you are absolutely a part of the problem. Another headline, Ron Paul, quote, "Zero chance Assad behind chemical weapons attack in Syria. Attack was likely a false flag." How much of our corporate media is covering that? And just because the corporate media constantly attacks Trump doesn't mean that Trump is not a part of the power structure. Perhaps there's some fracturing in the power structure, but that doesn't mean that they're not all part of it. They are all part of it. And the greatest likelihood is it's all a part of the act. But in either case, what's going on right now with the Trump administration is exactly what we would expect from the power structure. Trump's a part of it, just as Obama was, just as Clinton was, just as the Bushes were. Another headline, Tillerson warns Russia. Coalition steps are underway to remove Assad. Immediately after this false flag event, all their plans are already laid, just like they were after 9/11. They're desperate. They're willing to do anything to continue their agenda of hegemonic power and full-spectrum dominance. From that report, VIX was being crushed and stocks were leaking higher just as planned until Secretary of State Rex Tillerson hit the tape beating war drums and announcing a new U.S. policy on Syria just a week after he said the U.S. had no interest in removing the Syrian president, which was a lie. Specifically, Tillerson said, quote, that steps are underway to remove Syrian President Bashar al-Assad and that the U.S. is considering, quote, an appropriate response to the Syrian government's alleged use of chemical weapons. But the media repeats it as if it's already a known fact when that couldn't be further from the truth. It's clearly a false flag event, and the American population, how long will they take this kind of bait? When will they stand up? Continuing from the report, Tillerson said, the process by which Assad would leave is something that requires an international community effort both to first defeat ISIS, which the U.S. is absolutely not trying to do, continuing within Syria, to stabilize the Syrian country to avoid further civil war, just like we stabilized Iraq and Afghanistan and Libya. How many times does this have to occur? Finishing with this report, and then to work collectively with our partners around the world through a political process that would lead to Assad leaving. That's been the agenda from the beginning, hasn't it? All that Trump said about trying to avoid global conflict was all lies. The military-industrial complex has played this out exactly as they planned. No difference from former regimes, former presidents, all just different actors in the play. The report continues. As a result, Tillerson said that Assad's role in the future is uncertain, clearly with the acts that he has taken, already stating it as if it's fact that Assad did this, when all evidence indicates that is absolutely not true. It would seem that there would be no role for him to govern the Syrian people. Been the agenda from the beginning, has it not? Trump is carrying out that agenda, just like Obama was trying to carry out that agenda, just like Bush carried out his agenda with 9/11. They're all a part of the power structure. Another headline that was released immediately after the false flag event. U.S. weighs, quote, saturation strike against Syrian government in response to chemical attack, just like 9/11. Everything laid out beforehand, everything put on the table immediately after the false flag event was triggered. From that report, the Pentagon has developed plans for an airstrike against Syria. We know that's already taken place. This report goes on. How much more will come in the days ahead of us? How desperate will the power structure's actions be? I want to state, summing this all up, as I've tried to point out so many times, all of these actions, even going back to 9/11 and before, stem from a power structure that is desperate to control the world and global resources that are waning. There's not enough to go around. You can't hide it much longer. And the closer to that point of forced mass awakening becomes, the more desperate the power structure will become. It's up to us to beat them to the intersection, to disclose what they are, what they're doing, and why they're doing it before they're ready for that to happen. And that can only happen when all of us have properly prioritized. What are we doing with our time? And I realize that life involves certain responsibilities for all of us. I realize that. I'm in the same situation. But do we not reprioritize? If we're in a boat that's sinking and we're neck deep in water, do our priorities at that point change? And that's the position that we're in now. So as I've said over and over, as the biosphere implodes, as economies start to implode, the military-industrial complex will become desperate and start playing the kinds of cards that we just saw happen in Syria. So let's add some headlines to this. Global productivity slowdown risks creating instability, warns the International Monetary Fund. Yes, that's exactly what's happening. From that report, Christine Lagarde, anybody knows anything about Christine Lagarde, the epitome of power structure, twisted, demented criminality. Christine Lagarde says governments must invest in education and cutting red tape, which means gutting environmental protection like Trump just did. He's a part of the power structure, to encourage and drive up growth. Let's examine that for just a moment. How do you continue to grow and expand, loot, plunder, pillage resources on a finite planet with finite resources? You can't. It won't happen. It's falling apart now. That paradigm that's unimaginably flawed and transparent is falling apart now, and what's ensuing? The law of the jungle. That's what's happening. So here we have the IMF, the power structure, still pushing growth on a planet that's imploding. Direct contradiction. That report continues. The head of the International Monetary Fund, Christine Lagarde, has issued a stark warning that living standards will fall around the world unless governments take urgent action to increase productivity. Again, increase growth. How do you increase growth when you've already looted, pillaged, and plundered the planet's resources to the point where the biosphere is falling apart and they want more growth? And they're pushing for more growth, especially in military circles. And we're back to a cancer. People ask, why would they do this? Why would they continue to do this? And as if they wouldn't harm themselves along with the rest of us. They do. They always have. And they will, because we're not dealing with sanity. And I compare this again to a cancer. Does a cancer intend to kill its host? No, it intends to proliferate, no matter what, at any cost, until the host dies. That's the mentality we're dealing with. A headless, heartless, mindless cancer. That is the military-industrial complex, the medical-industrial complex, the central bankers, headless, heartless, soulless cancer that will kill us all if we don't stand up to it and change course. Final statements from this report, Lagarde warned that the world could not afford to leave productivity and growth in the doldrums. In direct contradiction to reality, that we're somehow supposed to continue growing on a planet that's imploding. And I'll get to some of those planet imploding headlines in a moment. Final statements from this report. Lagarde said governments must use, invest, and regulate incentives for business to ramp up again productivity, to ensure that the next generation will be better off. Do we really believe that Christine Lagarde wants or believes that the next generation will be better off from her actions? Does anyone believe that? From spraying the planet with toxic materials, playing God with the weather, tearing the life support systems of the atmosphere apart, contaminating the entire planet, proliferating toxic, lethal vaccinations everywhere so that autism has increased 40,000%, dementia's off the scale, Alzheimer's is off the scale, and Christine Lagarde is trying to convince us that she's attempting to ensure that the next generation will be better off? Wake up. It's time to wake up. A few headlines to go along with the economic collapse, which is an unavoidable consequence of biosphere collapse, which leads to military aggression all over the globe. Here's some headlines. I'll go through this quickly because I'm running out of time. Buffett's newspaper group slashes jobs. Another headline. Half of American families are desperately living paycheck to paycheck. Another headline. These are all from last week, by the way. Or this week, I should say. 16 large retailers besides JCPenney are closing waves of stores. Another headline, Lloyd's Banking Group to close hundreds of branches and cut hundreds of jobs. Another headline, what is America going to look like when stocks and home prices and even used cars all crash? That's happening already, except for the stock market, which they can artificially prop up till the last moment. Till the very last moment. And too many Americans are pacified by that completely fictitious house of cards. Another headline, shares of U.S. auto companies fall as car sales decline. Another headline, Shell confirms workers to be cut from Norwegian operations. Another headline, Mexico oil reserves gone in 9 years without new finds. There won't be any new finds of any significance, and most of Mexico's national income comes from the oil. What happens when that's gone? Almost there, and we don't have 9 years in this course anyway. Another headline, Kawasaki Heavy, that's heavy industries, to slash 30% of its Japan shipping industry, crashing also now. Another headline, Ralph Lauren to close flagship Fifth Avenue store. Very symbolic cut there. Another headline, China's record iron ore glut, enough to build 13,000 Eiffel Towers. Overproduction, nothing to do with it. Economy shutting down, and Christine Lagarde says we need to build more, extract more, loot, pillage, and plunder more. Total insanity. We're living in a Truman Show of total insanity. Another headline, China's plan to make jet fuel from restaurant leftovers. Really? From French fry grease or Chinese food grease, we're going to fly jets all over. This is complete fallacy. This is simply a distractionary headline that some people seem to think will somehow make some sort of a difference. It's mind-boggling that people can even buy into a headline like that. Another headline, real cost of Fukushima disaster will reach $70 trillion or triple government's estimates, says think tank. That's not true. That's not true. It's exponentially worse. In fact, it's incalculably worse because there is no cure for Fukushima. It will continue to be a nuclear volcano for no one knows how long. And we're going to have more Fukushimas soon as the industrialized societal paradigm shuts down and over 400 nuclear sites begin to go into meltdown. It's a matter of time. Now, regarding Fukushima, the contamination of the Pacific, the rapidly warming oceans, and the imploding biosphere. Another headline in that regard. Salmon farming in crisis. We're all seeing a chemical arms race in the sea. More human insanity. From that report, the fish farming industry claims to be performing an important task by providing food for the world. And this is a lie. Farm salmon are fed largely by stripping the seas of forager fish, the base of the ocean food chain, in order to feed farmed salmon. The radical overfishing is helping to fuel the overall collapse of the entire food chain in the seas. On top of this, farmed salmon are one of the most toxic foods you can consume. Exploding incidences of disease and parasites are promoting fish farmers to dump immense amounts of chemicals into the waters around the fish farms. Here's a quote from a recent report that said this: what we are seeing now is a chemical arms race in the seas, just like on land farms, where the resistance of plants to chemicals is growing. In fish farms, the parasites are increasing resistance to chemicals and antibiotics. There has been a tenfold increase in the use of some chemicals in the past 18 months. They're saturating whole sections of oceans with chemicals to try to kill off the parasites, to keep the fish farms alive, killing those sections of oceans. And the fish farms are dying anyway. Human insanity on every level. Back to the imploding economies that must follow the imploding biosphere, and then the global conflict, as I highlighted in the beginning of this show, that's directly linked to all of them, the end result of all of them. Continuing with this headline, the climate could hit a state unseen in 50 million years. From that report, no, the headline is not a typo. Current carbon dioxide levels are unprecedented in human history and are on track to climb to even more ominous heights in just a few decades. If carbon emissions continue, and this includes methane, by the way, and so many people don't count methane, and so many people want to cling to their ideology that because carbon is necessary, the more the better. That's wrong. That's absolutely wrong. The environment can only take so much of any given element, and then things start to die, like oceans that are acidifying right now. And nobody even considers the methane that's filling our atmosphere right now. So Can any rational person think that there's anything natural with what's happening on our planet right now when we're talking about something that hasn't happened in tens of millions of years, happened in the geologic blink of an eye, in perfect lockstep with human activity, which includes climate engineering, by the way. All forms of human activity that affect the Earth's energy balance are forms of geoengineering. That could be blowing up nuclear bombs, deforestation, killing the ocean, paving the planet. Those are all forms of geoengineering. They're altering the natural habitat. We need to consider all of those sources, while at the same time prioritizing the worst sources of human activity that are harming our biosphere the most severely, and that's climate engineering. So we're talking about, again, changes that haven't been seen in 50 million years, and there's a report I'm coming up to in a moment I'll try to get to that extends that timeline out even further. Adding to what's happening, imploding civilizations, military conflict, another report, again, this from this week. Nile Delta's increasing salinity and rising sea levels may make Egypt uninhabitable. Not enough habitat, the law of the jungle ensues as people don't have enough to eat. From that report, Egypt's fresh water is decreasing at alarming rates. The country will face nationwide shortages by 2025. According to a report published in the Geological Society of America, the report forecasts that dwindling freshwater supplies and the increasing salinity level of the Nile's delta agricultural land threaten to make the country uninhabitable. Don't hear much of those headlines from our local media, do we? Another headline, India heat wave shows no sign of relief across the southern states. Conditions have led to severe water crises. When people don't have enough to eat or drink, things get very bad very quickly. Why would we think otherwise? This is happening all over the globe. Now here's a headline for those that have been convinced by the corporate media that they are the only ones that have real news when the exact opposite is true. They are the real purveyors of fake propagandistic news in order to galvanize the population to support the power structure assaults of aggression all over the globe. Here's a headline for those that only believe corporate media from the New York Times. Here's the headline. To curb global warming, science fiction may become science fact. From that report, scientists must start looking into this seriously. What are they talking about? Climate engineering. From that report, news about the climate has become alarming over the last few months. In December, startled scientists revealed that the temperatures in some parts of the Arctic had spiked more than 35 degrees over normal levels and their historical averages. In March, others reported that the sea ice in the Arctic had dropped to its lowest level on record. A warming ocean has already killed large chunks of Australia's Great Barrier Reef. The Great Barrier Reef is done. The kelp forest around Australia is done. Ecosystems all over the world are done. Fish are washing up on shores all over the world. Can't hide that much longer. When people don't have enough to eat, chaos ensues. Back to the report from the Times, it states this. Let's get real. The odds that these processes could be slowed, i.e. carbon production, let alone stopped by deploying more solar panels and wind turbines seems unrealistic, even before the Trump administration's election. It's even less likely now that Mr. Trump has gone to work undermining strategies to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. That's where engineering the climate comes in. Last month, scholars from the physical and social sciences who are interested in climate change gathered in Washington to discuss approaches like cooling the planet by shooting aerosols or spraying them into the stratosphere for whitening clouds to reflect sunlight back into space. All of this is from the New York Times, for those who only believe corporate media, which may prove indispensable to prevent the disastrous consequences of warming. The report continues. Aerosols could be loaded into military jets to be sprayed into the atmosphere. I'll stop there. How many times, by how many corporate media liars have we been marginalized by these people? Those of us who are trying to tell the truth, what's blatantly obvious is happening in our skies. We have film footage to prove it. We have congressional documents to prove it. We have long lists of patents to prove it. Mountains and mountains and mountains of data. We have photographs of the nozzles mounted to the pylons, aimed into the exhaust jet stream. It's endless. The amount of data we have is endless, and we have those people in Northern California here. I'll use an example of the KRCR people, Mike Mangus, their news anchor, the North State's top newspaper, the Record Searchlight, Silas Lyons, for example, these people doing everything they can to avoid the science terms, to try to marginalize this issue, to try to make the public believe it isn't happening because that's their job. And they're all too happy to be obedient, paid disinformation tools for the power structure. And that's exactly what they are, and those are exactly the kind of people that it's up to us to peacefully hold accountable, and at some point, hopefully, legally accountable, because they have blatantly ignored information. And even our local officials here in Reading presented, not once but twice, mountains of data, including testing from former government scientists, proving there's mountains of heavy metals raining down on us, same metals used in climate engineering patents, given absolutely volumes of data to prove these issues are going on, and indisputable data in regard to the testing and the heavy metal contamination, and they have done nothing. Are not such people to be held accountable by a population that's been harmed by their unwillingness to disclose the truth? Do we not have an obligation to our children, to the planet, to ourselves to hold them accountable? But this report from the New York Times, stating exactly what we have always said is happening, aerosols could be loaded into military jets to be sprayed into the atmosphere, straight from the New York Times. So for those who have tried to ram their heads as far as they could in the sand and remain in denial, how long will you stay there? How long? I want to continue with a few environmental reports. I'm almost out of time. Arctic sea ice reduction since 1978 is immense. Half of the total ice that has disappeared since 2016 in 1 year. Half. It's accelerating rapidly, unimaginable pace. All of this leads into everything I talked about in the beginning of this program. Military aggression to acquire the resources necessary to keep the military-industrial complex juggernaut of insanity alive at any cost to populations, to the planet. So as the planet implodes, the human race displaying its propensity toward self-induced suicide by expanding the military-industrial complex more, as Mr. Twain said in the beginning of the show. A few more headlines before we're out of time. Doomsday Library joins Doomsday Seed Vault in Arctic Norway. The elites are preparing, are they not, with the Doomsday Seed Vault? And please look up anything I'm saying. Please don't believe anything. Look it up yourself. I never ask anyone to believe me. Look it up. So now they're preparing a Doomsday Library as well to join the Doomsday Seed Vault, because they know that collapse is at our doorstep now. From that report, the so-called Doomsday Seed Vault, located underground on a remote island in the Arctic Ocean, has gained a neighbor, and the new vault opened March 27th. It will act as a digital archive for the world's data. They're trying to save whatever they can before everything collapses. That's what's going on. It's going on right now. Back to Mr. Trump. Another headline here. Trump plan to slash EPA budget goes even deeper, new memo shows. The attempt by this administration, which is just a part of the power structure, to mask from the public as long as possible the imploding biosphere is clear. How much more clear could it be? But it's not just the U.S., it's not just Trump. Let's move to Mr. Putin now. Putin defends climate deniers and looks forward to the Arctic melting. So says this report, which was covered, by the way, from multiple sources. From the report, Russian President Vladimir Putin praised U.S. EPA head Scott Pruitt during a television interview on Thursday, then went on to say Russia stands to benefit from global warming, despite the fact that the country has already seen deaths, wildfires, and anthrax outbreaks related to climate change. Russia and China also collaborating and colluding with the U.S. on the climate engineering assault of planet Earth, all for their own reasons. Populations all over the globe being subjected to what amounts to a biological assault that's destroying the planet on which their lives and their children's lives depend. All major powers are engaged in this. We must realize this. We must face this reality, all of us. A final headline before I sign off. Climate warming potentially unprecedented in 420 million years. Given the level of human activity and destruction of this planet, does anyone really think it's normal? Final thoughts. We have the choice to turn our sadness and despair into a righteous anger. Such justifiable rage is an extremely effective and powerful fuel for motivating us to use every possible peaceful means at our disposal to wake the masses, to fully expose the criminal cancer that's creating and perpetuating the current course of certain near-term planetary omnicide. Now, more than ever, we must all investigate the frontline facts and fully face reality. We must decide why we are here. We must stand up and make our voices heard. Until next week, this is Dane Wigington with GeoEngineeringWatch.org.